Bitter cold weather gripping much of the nation right now and for a while. So whatever happened to this?
The world is heating up fast and we have ourselves to blame.
Global warming is real and we humans are almost certainly the cause.
It's a phantom. God controls the climate. Come on.
This monster storm just might break the back of their global warming plans. My next guest says it's a win for the American people.
This is a primitive form of science. I say God bless the 1,000+ coal plants they're going to be bringing on in the developing world.
You want more carbon in the atmosphere?
Absolutely. It's the most humane, moral choice.
We can pass a bunch of laws that will destroy our economy, but it isn't going to change the weather.
The people of Canada didn't expect that they were voting for a government that would be censoring their scientists.
It is very difficult to significantly lower emissions growth. They cannot be simply reduced by declaring a target and saying it will be met, because that isn't going to happen.
The climate of the past may not be our guideline for the climate of the future. The variables have changed. Over centuries, human beings have multiplied. So has our waste. It exists. We exist. And like everything else, we must be taken into account. We have altered the distribution of many things. Water, mercury, fluoride, carbon. The data exists.
The lag effect is pretty large.
It's time for action. Changing stores of water. Increasingly severe extreme events, precipitation and drought.
Humans aren't stupid.
I gotta be honest, I'm new to this climate change stuff. Basically, I was asked to make this doc for the United Nations and I was like, why not, right? Get to learn, get to drive and meet some cool professors. Thank you very much. The science is so simple, it's scary. Sometimes I feel like we're trying not to understand. That ends now. It's time to end the climate change debate and move on to decision making under uncertainty. Instead, this is what we're hearing.
The global warming alarm spread by Al Gore in the United Nations is in utter scientific collapse.
Me thinks someone is playing fast and loose with this whole subject.
What about the fact that is the overwhelming consensus of all the climate scientists?
That's not true.
It is true.
No.
Yes.
People debate whether humans contribute to climate change. Does it really matter when we're seeing a rise in record-breaking weather events? Let's just look at the past year. Finland has had its hottest and coldest days ever recorded. Worldwide, it was the 4th hottest year on record, yet the Northern Hemisphere saw its 4th highest snowfall. Globally, it was the hottest November ever, and on November 7th, Typhoon Haiyan made landfall with the fastest wind speeds in recorded history. Over a 90-day period, Australia broke 123 weather records. It was the hottest year in the continent's recorded history.
We live sort of in the present, and we keep thinking the present is the way it always has been. But when it comes to environmental issues, one of the key issues is, are things changing? And if so, why? And what's the cause of the change? For this, we need long-term data.
This is the data retrieved from the Mauna Loa Observatory in Hawaii. The observatory has been compiling daily data since 1956 and now has more than 100 monitoring sites around the globe. The graph on the right tells the story. The progression is exponentially steeper by the year. When you look at this steady rise in CO2, you almost wonder if this could be a natural shift. Scientists do tell us that the Earth is in constant flux, right? However, when you take data from before the industrial age, you get an entirely different picture.
It's been possible to reconstruct measurements, time series of the history since the advent of radiocarbon dating.
As you can see, the CO2 has not risen above 300 parts per million in 400,000 years. But how can we be sure that the data is accurate?
This frozen library, the National Ice Core Lab in Denver, Colorado, has ice from all over. The oldest core here goes back some 400,000 years.
Summer, winter, summer, winter. Like tree rings, we can date the core. Cores hold other and even more important secrets. Look at these bubbles. They formed as the snow turned to ice and trapped old air that's still in there.
We know how greenhouse gas molecules work. We know how they like to move, and we know how they interact with radiation. pretty basic science. It says if you're putting more of those molecules in the atmosphere, they're going to absorb more radiation. Treating the atmosphere like a big black box, that black box is going to heat up.
I drove to the University of Toronto to speak with Kimberley Strong, a professor of atmospheric physics and researcher at the Pearl Research Lab in Antarctica. She has spent the last decade collecting, observing, and mapping our changing atmosphere.
My research involves doing measurements of atmospheric composition. So we use a variety of different instruments and techniques to measure gases in the atmosphere. We also do measurements of ozone and gases related to ozone chemistry. And we also measure pollutants in the atmosphere, things related to air quality. Greenhouse gases are trapping more heat in the lower atmosphere, but in fact that's actually cooling the stratosphere. Okay? And so if temperatures in the stratosphere are colder, some of the chemical reactions that destroy ozone will tend to slow down. And so in fact we expect kind of globally that will help ozone recovery. On the other hand, if the stratosphere gets colder in the polar regions, so in the Arctic and the Antarctic, then the conditions that lead to ozone depletion in the spring will be enhanced. And so we may see more ozone depletion in the polar regions in the springtime. So there's these kind of two competing effects. In spring of 2011, we had very severe stratospheric ozone depletion. We were right there in Eureka, and the chemistry that was destroying ozone was kind of more or less right overhead. We could compare those with measurements that had been done at Eureka for the previous 15 years to show that the ozone depletion that year was at a record low level. The stratosphere was unusually stable and very cold that winter. So the chemistry that leads to ozone depletion relies on very low temperatures. Well, one of the advantages of living in the satellite age is that we really can see how gases are emitted and then transported around the globe. And so, for example, back in 1999, NASA launched a satellite called Terra, and one of the instruments on that is an instrument called MOPIT. And so MOPIT was really one of the first instruments to measure carbon monoxide, which is a pollutant. It comes from fossil fuels. It has a number of different sources. And carbon monoxide has a fairly long lifetime of several months. And so that means that when it's emitted in the atmosphere, it sticks around for a while. Okay? And that means that you can really see how it's being transported. And so there are these beautiful movies from MOPIT that kind of show you kind of in a time-lapse way these transport pathways where pollutants emitted in one part of the globe very clearly get transported elsewhere.
Let's look at the Mauna Loa record again, this time combined with a chart of annual Arctic sea ice area. These trajectories coincide with direct UV rays traveling through the thin ozone on both poles. More carbon dioxide means more reflected heat, and we can all see which hemisphere is creating the most carbon.
No one who knows anything about climate has argued all of climate is human, but we can pinpoint that things have been going very oddly over the last 100 years, and we can pinpoint this is human related, this is not part of natural variability. And we've seen some striking changes. We've shown, using our fossil methods, we've shown that the climate started changing about 100 years ago, and it's been accelerating. So we often refer to the Arctic as the sort of like the miner's canaries of the planet. It's the first to show signs of environmental change to the greatest degree. Every time you see a lake and pond, it contains a history of that environment. And that's because lakes slowly fill with mud 24 hours a day, 365 days of the year. That becomes like a history book or a time machine. The deeper you go, the older it is. And we have ways of removing that history book and also looking at the information contained in those layers. There's all sorts of information at the bottom of the lake. There's fossils of what lived in the lake. Since we know what these organisms require, and we can find their fossils going down in history, we can see how these organisms' assemblages have changed over time. And by looking at that, we can reconstruct how the environment has changed. We've been sampling a series of ponds and lakes near Cape Herschel, and we've been working on these about 40 ponds going back since 1983. Based on our fossil analysis, we could show that yes, indeed, the climate has been changing over the last century, and we couldn't link it to natural causes. It seemed to be linked to humans. And we made the predictions that if this warming continues, eventually these ponds, which we knew have been their permanent water bodies for thousands of years, would simply evaporate away. Well, that prediction came true over the last decade or so. We slowly watched these ponds change, and they got shallower and shallower. And we were also monitoring the water chemistry. And as time went by, they were getting a little saltier. And that's exactly what you'd expect. We were measuring the salt each year very carefully, and we could show the steady increase in salt. Well, starting in about 2006 or so, the ponds, some of these ponds started evaporating completely. So these were ecosystems that have been there for thousands of years, and now they're gone.
Time in the field matters, you know? Dr. Smol's been going to the Arctic for like 30 years. He's seen entire areas just evaporate. I mean, I didn't see that coming. Dr. Smol referred me to Dr. Richard Peltier, a man whose research has added an important element to the concept of sea level rise, a subject that is talked about a lot but rarely understood. I certainly had a lot to learn.
Well, there are really two main sources of present-day sea level rise. The first of these, and in many ways the most dramatic, is the impact on sea level rise that's associated with the melting of large accumulations of land ice on the continents. In particular, the Greenland ice sheet and the Antarctic ice sheet, which are very, very well known to be melting at an increasingly rapid rate. A second contribution is that which comes from what we call the steric impact of the global warming process. As the water in the ocean warms up, the volume of water in the ocean expands, and this leads to a rise in sea level. But there's also a missing component, which we still do not adequately understand, which is also associated with the loss of land ice from what we call small ice sheets and glaciers.
Our altimetric satellites have put the total rate of sea level rise at 3 millimeters per year. When you add up the annual melting in the Antarctic and Arctic, you get about 0.9 millimeters. When you account for the steric effect, you get another 0.6. So what does that mean for the rest? Does that come from melting sea ice?
Modern tide gauge measured rates of relative sea level rise, the impact on the GRACE measurements, the impact on altimetric satellite measurements, all of these data are very significantly contaminated by the influence of what we call glacial isostatic adjustment.
When the ice melts on the poles, the Earth begins to take its natural shape.
The main change in shape is the change in shape from a shape which is more curling rock-like, more squashed at the poles, right, to a more spherical shape. And that squashed shape at the poles was actually produced by the large ice loads that existed on the poles at last glacial maximum. Right? So when these ice sheets were eliminated, the fluidity, if you like, of the planet allows it to rebound slowly back towards a more spherical shape after the ice load on the poles has been removed.
For years we have analyzed local changes in shape by beach elevation, but physicists are using data from the Earth's rotation to predict future changes in shape, as well as confirm the internal viscosity of the planet. They have discovered that there is a close connection between fluid dynamics and sea level rise through plate tectonics and the Earth's changing shape.
And it has been argued that 3 million years ago, sea level at that time was higher by 22 plus or minus 5 meters than it is at present. This is the so-called Pliocene warm period. The carbon dioxide load in the atmosphere was about equal to modern. Now it's known that at that time the Greenland ice sheet did not yet exist, but the Greenland ice sheet only involves about 7 meters. If we were to add to the budget the loss of all of the ice from West Antarctica, that would give us perhaps another 5.5 or 6 meters. Right? So there would still be a missing 9 meters. So think carefully about what this might mean. It would mean that on a very long time scale, right, if we were to sit locked in the present day carbon dioxide concentration regime, and we were to wait long enough, right, for the long time scale feedbacks to fully come into play, which involve the loss of land ice, right, then we would lose all of Greenland, we would lose all of West Antarctica, we would lose a big chunk of at least coastal East Antarctic ice. Again, plate tectonic effects may have contributed to these estimates of the amount by which sea level was higher during the warm Pliocene.
One of the regions most studied is the Pine Island Glacier in West Antarctica. This glacier is losing mass at the fastest rate on the continent. The destruction does not come from above. Warm ocean water is attacking the ice shelf connected to the glacier, which eliminates the buttressing effect that is keeping the glacier from flowing towards the sea. Pieces of this ice shelf, some the size of New York City and Hong Kong, are now floating free in the ocean. Greenland is facing a different danger.
Because of melting during the melt season on the surface of the Greenland ice sheet, we can make meltwater percolate down to the base of the ice sheet through what we call moulins, great crevasses, if you like, in the ice. And once this water makes it to the base of the ice, it may so lubricate the base of the ice sheet, right, that it's able to dynamically flow much more rapidly towards the sea.
Alright, so it really seems like the sea level is rising. Heat from the sun travels through holes in the ozone and melts land ice on the poles. The more this happens, the more the Earth's shape changes. The more the Earth's shape changes, the more we see land and sea elevation shift. We are not prepared for these inevitable changes. Carbon is entering the atmosphere at rates we have not seen before. When I traveled to Waterloo University, I found out that carbon emissions are largely out of direct human control. If this makes you feel relieved, I suggest you think again.
Forests are constantly exchanging two big greenhouse gases, water vapor and CO2. When you're looking at a healthy, sustainable forest system, you want them to be happy and productive enough that they're taking in more CO2 than they're releasing back to the atmosphere. Forests store less than a wetland would, because wetlands are usually covered by different types of mosses and they tend to decompose a lot slower. We have to pay attention to how permafrost is melting, how that's affecting water and energy movement through the landscape, and how that feeds back to the atmosphere and the climate.
If too much ice melts in the tundra, plant life will become oversaturated and die. When plants die, the carbon stored in their fiber is released back into the atmosphere.
A third of the world's carbon is stored in that zone. So as we start to change productivity, especially start to thaw some of that carbon, that can be really important feedback.
While the tundra gets drunk with water, NASA's GRACE satellites are witnessing a loss of groundwater around the world. Many of our populated areas are drying up. We are simply using too much water. The water cycle can't keep up, and hundreds of millions of people are feeling the pressure.
We have significant challenges ahead of us with respect to water quantity and, of course, with respect to water quality. Groundwater is really our largest reservoir of fresh water in the world, representing about 2% of all our water. By comparison, the lakes and rivers, from which we draw much of our drinking water, represents only 0.007% of all of our water. Of course, water is overall a renewable resource, but as we know, groundwater flows very slowly, is replenished very slowly, and in many parts of the world we're over-pumping the groundwater, which is causing groundwater tables to drop dramatically. It's causing subsidence of the soil.
This is what it looks like when we've tapped ourselves dry. These trends span the entire world. It's simple math. There are about 6 billion more people on the planet than there was before the Industrial Revolution, and only 2% of our water is drinkable, and nearly all of it comes from the ground. We contaminate our soil every day, and changes in water flow can transport these chemicals without warning.
The climate models that are predicting more droughts in some regions, more floods in other regions, more hurricanes as we've got more heat in the oceans.
Sea level is rising. If you have more storms, you get more what's called a storm surge. The winds push the water up over the land, and as we can show by documented evidence, we are having more intense precipitation events already.
Some of these precipitation events can be attributed to cloud formations created by large ocean freighters and the thousands of airplanes that fly around the world each day. Jet planes leave condensation in their wake that form unnatural cloud formations with the potential to connect massive storms together.
Water is a huge issue. We either have too much or too little. The situation of extended drought conditions costing economically, jobs, as well as environmental, huge impacts in this decade. And we're getting more intense precipitation events, which lead to the deluges like we had in Toronto in the summer, which cost the insurance companies $800 million. The society costs are way beyond that.
As the Earth continues to warm, fragile ecosystems fall apart. We are already seeing massive extinctions in areas all over the world.
As the climate is changing, we're changing those conditions in the atmosphere. It's just making everything more dynamic. The more dynamic means it's going to be more variable. So we're going to have periods in a particular location that might have more storms, more intense storms. We really need to wrap our heads around the natural climate cycle. So a lot of these colder than normal periods that we experience now are because of things like La Nina and these sort of natural climate oscillations that are happening anyway. So how are they going to change? Those types of fluctuations are going to become more prominent with climate change. It's not just everything's going to heat up and melt. Things are going to get really variable too.
In many parts of the world, we're polluting the groundwater by dumping industrial chemicals, by a lot of our fertilizers and nutrients that we're applying to the land, pesticides, pharmaceuticals.
We're seeing noticeable changes in whole ecosystems. Anywhere you see a change, the effects of that change are being propagated through the whole system. And I think that's one of the challenges the climate community faces now, is trying to better understand, these effects.
The city of Manila has, they say officially 10 million people, but in fact they figure that probably there's 15 million there. And those people, those other 5 million, are coming and going. And most of them have no property. They're desperate for a job. They come to the city river basin. And those rivers are now flooding. The country of Philippines had, by UN official numbers, 33 disasters last year. Families, little kids, are living in this environment, and my God, the river comes along, they lose everything.
The studies that we have done are indicating that we may see the floods that may exceed the historical floods up to 20%. I mean, nowadays the most losses, economic losses experienced from natural disasters are coming from flooding.
Obviously, the main risk of flooding is to human life, but the damage done to local infrastructure can be just as deadly. Flooding can block important escape routes, and without bridges and roads, emergency crews can find themselves separated from those in need. The transportation of polluted water can also affect the environment. The Fukushima nuclear power plant leaked radiation into the ocean. Sewage backs up to the surface, bringing disease and infection, and agricultural areas can lose entire crops, leading to famine.
Industrial activities, it may have some impacts on the kind of water quality that flooded water may carry with it to areas that may not be exposed to kind of these different chemicals. And the repetition of the events is sending a very clear message that a particular type of land use and rules and regulations will need to be changed in order to prevent or minimize the damage in the future.
With water quality diminishing all over the world, many experts are arguing that water resource security will be the major source of global conflict in the future. It makes sense. You can't drink oil. You can't wash yourself with oil. You can't grow crops with oil. We are not being responsible with our water resources.
Our water resources have come to us over many, many years, and the climate that's been in this area at that time, and that climate's changing. So we don't know that our rainfall or our precipitation inputs are going to be the same.
We are exporting obscene amounts of water from the Great Lakes region to some of the driest areas in North America. Here's the problem. When you transport water out of its natural area, you disturb the water cycle. Water levels have lowered, and we can't guarantee that these levels will rebound.
Let's start to adapt to what we're seeing.
We're going to have to think about issues of migration. And we've got all these borders to put in for post-colonial reasons. If they made any sense before, they don't make any sense now in the climatic conditions. So you have migrations of people coming to a border, and the new guy says, no, you can't cross here.
I really do think it's the major issue on the planet. We hear about terrorism and the economy. Well, let's not pretend that climate change is not going to affect the economy. It's going to be the biggest factor on the economy. Let's just make the list. It affects, agriculture. It affects forestry. It affects fisheries. It affects natural resources. It affects tourism. It affects health. The list goes on and on. It has very strong economic consequences, but those economic consequences have not been factored in yet. It's seen as some sort of cost to mitigate climate change. What's the cost of not mitigating climate change? That's what we should be asking the question. There is some denial that it's happening, but we have lots of time, and we have a much more important problem that we have to deal with, or the public doesn't see it as an imminent problem. Everyone has an excuse, like if we do it and the province next to us doesn't do it, then well, we've given them an economic advantage, and it all comes down to this. Well, at some point we have to start showing leadership, but people are very reluctant, it seems, to show leadership in this type of thing, and partly because they don't see immediate returns. What you're doing here, you're going to see your returns maybe in decades, centuries, or maybe even a long period of time, and we have a real problem doing a lot of action if we're not going to get credit for it.
I finished my documentary just in time to send it to Warsaw. I didn't have money to follow my film to Poland, so I scoured the internet for news, hoping to see meaningful progress. On the eve of the Conference of Parties, Mother Nature was the first to speak.
My country is being tested by this hellstorm called Super Typhoon Haiyan. We remain uncertain as to the full extent of the damage and devastation as information trickles in agonizingly slow manner because power lines and communication lines have been cut off and may take a while before they are restored. The initial assessment showed that Haiyan left a wake of massive destruction that is unprecedented, unthinkable, and horrific. And the devastation is staggering. I struggle to find words even for the images that we see on the news coverage, and I struggle to find words to describe how I feel about the losses. Can we ever attain the ultimate objective of the convention, which is to prevent dangerous anthropogenic interference with the climate system? By failing to meet the objective of the convention, we may have ratified our own doom. In solidarity with my countrymen who are struggling to find food back home, and with my brother who has not had food for the last 3 days, I will now commence a voluntary fasting for the climate. This means I will voluntarily refrain from eating food during this COP until a meaningful outcome is in sight, until concrete pledges have been made to ensure mobilization of resources for the Green Climate Fund. We cannot afford a fourth COP with an empty GCF. Until the promise of the operationalization of a loss and damage mechanism has been fulfilled, until there is assurance on finance for adaptation, until we see real ambition on climate action in accordance with the principles we have so upheld. Mr. President, this process has been called a farce. It has been called an annual carbon-intensive gathering of useless frequent flyers. It has also been called saving tomorrow today. We can fix this. We can stop this madness.
A final protest call from a handful of campaigners. There has been some progress, small steps towards a new emissions reduction agreement, but for many here, that's not enough. Campaigners walked out of the meeting on Thursday. Their complaint, too little is being done by the rich countries to help the poorest and most vulnerable countries. The meeting did see $100 million promised by European countries to help poor nations. It's hoped this will clear the way for donors to give the newly established Green Climate Fund $100 billion a year by 2020. Until now, it's been difficult to track these promises.
That goes to sort of deepen the mistrust and deepen the inability of countries to say, okay, we have this amount of money, therefore we can adapt this far.
Getting basic agreement on only some general principles has taken years. It'll take much more work to get a new globally binding agreement ready by 2015. And this will be the true test of just how seriously countries the world over are taking the threat of climate change.
It was disappointing. I wasn't going to influence policymakers. I decided to go into the streets to get the public's opinion.
Are you worried at all about any kind of weather event that might happen in the future?
We're not worried. It's nature. God's, that's the way it is.
I never think about it that much. If they didn't change it already, I don't think it's going to change again.
Or is it like because of carbon dioxide and everything like that? Yeah.
Like the polar ice caps are melting, or the sun's cycle is supposed to even get lower, and we're not even supposed to see that much sunshine. So like
the world just being the world.
You don't think that's something that's affecting us?
Well, I don't know. I think it's probably like a real phenomenon, but like there isn't much coverage on it or anything like that.
The existence of all these billions of people on Earth have all influenced the climate of Earth, but none of it is of significance, and thank goodness, things are doing just fine.
The mistake they made on the hard left when they piled into this global warming thing is that they tried to politicize science itself. It's between 10 and 100 times more expensive to try to make global warming go away today with this renewable energy scam than it is to let it happen and pay the cost of adapting to its consequences, even if they're as bad and expensive as the propagandists try to say they are.
It's interesting when climate change experts are being paired up against people who don't really have a climate change background.
When you have people displaced on continental scales, we're talking about tens of millions of people, you're going to have trouble. So the sooner you get started on that problem, the better.
These are all predictions based on climate models. These predictions that Bill's going are based on climate models that violate 81 out of 87 of the basic principles of forecasting. And if you actually do, right now the developing world's getting 1,000 plus coal plants. There are 1.3 billion people don't have running water and electricity. If we actually go the route of trying to stop carbon-based energy, which has been their lifeline, which would lower infant mortality and long life expectancy, it would be the most immoral position you could take.
Sure, it makes for a really interesting discussion, but I feel like it polarizes the debate in a way that it shouldn't be.
What kind of information do you know or have you heard about climate change?
There's definitely human impact on climate change. One of the biggest issues we need to look at, though, is the data set of information that we have. It's a very short set versus the time that the Earth has existed. We have information going back maybe about 500 years.
I don't know about nothing, but I've been hearing like global warming.
I don't know as much as I would need to. I focus on some of the other community issues.
Methane emissions from cattle and livestock that we raise to support our over excessive eating, things like that.
I guess pollution does have something to do with it.
I don't really know much about climate change, but it's constantly changing, and the weather that we're having right now in Canada, it's pretty messed up, so yeah.
It's time for a history lesson.
So coming up, a discussion with David Boyd about his book on environmental rights in Canada. I'm Sean Courage, and you're listening to episode 42 of Nature's Past, a podcast of the Networking Canadian History and Environment.
The modern nation-state of Canada originates in 1867 through an act of the British Parliament called the British North America Act. Natural resources figured really prominently in the constitutional debates in the 1860s to create the country, because natural resources were seen as the economic rock bed of the foundation of this country.
There are places near the sea where no tourists come. Places where men go out and come back shift after shift, out under the sea to dig for coal.
Canada was kind of destined to become a leader in the world because it was enriched with minerals, forests, water, and other resources.
Canadians have always been great for digging. They've been digging for a treasure chest ever since 1795.
And so the responsibility over the exploitation of those resources was a really hotly contested issue in terms of the establishment of the British North America Act, which is Canada's first constitution. By the 1970s, Canadians were beginning to become aware that their industrial activities, which had been the rockbed of economic growth over the 19th and 20th century, were having environmental feedback effects. And so there was pressure on the federal government to develop a kind of national approach to environmental protection, except that the Constitution leaves the management of natural resources in the hands of the provinces.
They've been chopping and sawing away at the place for a long time, but you still can't see Canada for the trees. And some of the trees you can't see for apples.
And so since the 1970s, right up to the present, the federal government has always struggled to establish legislation to protect the environment, because the responsibility over natural resources is a provincial responsibility.
Canadians make more telephone calls than any other people on Earth. Fortunately, they also mine more nickel.
Canadian governments have struggled with balancing economic and environmental interests, and potentially at times of economic prosperity, environmental protection legislation tends to do better. During times of economic recession, the case for environmental protection goes into decline. In the noon mown hay, you can sleep all day, and the bars all have free lunches. Where the mail train stops and there ain't no cops, and the folks are tender-hearted. You meet Bill Fox with his pocket full of rocks, and you know that's where he started. And it's a problem that Canadians have not been able to resolve since the 1970s. Canadian environmental advocacy has been spotty, let's say.
Canadians can generally count on the coming of spring. That's the time of year they pay their income tax and go out and look for some more oil.
Strong and free, and stand on guard, oh Canada, we stand on guard for thee, oh Canada,
glory. According to this repeated nationwide survey, more doctors smoke Camels than any other cigarette. Why not change to Camels for the next 30 days and see what a difference it makes in your smoking enjoyment?
What we need is good scientific data before I'm going to accept and submit to the proposition that smoking is a hazard.
Public health efforts to reduce smoking in Canada took a very long time to influence public perception of smoking. Most Canadians couldn't initially see the connection between the adverse health effects of smoking and the individual act of smoking. Just as in the present, it's really difficult to make the connection between getting in your car and driving to work and making a contribution to global greenhouse gas emissions. And this, I think, is the problem with trying to influence public perception of climate change.
Americans are in the grip of a new disease, a very serious disease. The diseases I'm speaking about are smokeophobia and cancerophobia.
This is now akin to medieval witchcraft, where we used to blame witches for controlling the weather.
None of the things which have been found in tobacco smoke are at concentrations which can be considered harmful.
So carbon dioxide is good for you.
The last 15 years, CO2 has gone up by several points and global temperatures have stayed stable.
After years of controversy, scientists still disagree about the alleged hazards of cigarette smoking.
Even the president's own Science and Technology Office head, Mr. Holdren, says no one single weather event is due specifically to climate change.
Obviously, it's time to replace controversy with facts. Statistics may show association, but they do not show cause and effect.
I do not dismiss the fact that the global temperatures have risen. I debate whether man is the sole cause of it and whether man can fix it.
Smoking may be hazardous, it may not be. No one, including TV7, knows for certain. We want to see the smoking and health questions answered, not with the government making our personal decisions, but with open, honest research.
Climate isn't actually something you can see. It isn't something you can feel. Climate describes average temperatures over a prolonged period of time. I can't feel 20 years of temperature just by sticking my hand out the window, but I can feel weather. A 20-year-old smoker can't immediately make the connection between taking a drag and getting lung cancer or emphysema later in life. And so it's very difficult to shape public perception when we're dealing with problems that span long periods of time.
It's a challenge staying engaged in a world that seems chaotic and undisciplined, especially when you can't see hope in your own future.
Hey, what up, buddy? Oh, buddy. Buddy, all this is for you. Come on, let's get in there. Let's get at this. What are you doing? Yeah.
Bro, really, where have you been? You need to come around more often.
Man, I've been telling you, this doc, I have to finish this, man. This is stuff that I don't think people are really thinking about.
Ray, I know you're doing something right. I know that an example needs to be set, but if you're gonna lead people, you gotta lead in every way. It's gotta be complete, and you've gotta be complete.
It doesn't make a lot of sense to mobilize a national movement on air pollution or a national movement on water pollution if those issues are dealt with at the provincial level. In the present, Canada's sort of national environmental movement is much less cohesive than perhaps in the United States, where the environmental movement very much focused on the national level in terms of lobbying Congress.
I was invited to attend the Power Shift Youth Conference in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. I was hoping to be reinvigorated by the brand of American passion that is so lacking on the Canadian landscape.
This is your moment. This is your time. This is the time when you will make a difference.
We are creating change right now. We are creating a change in the climate right now. The change in the political climate. The change in the climate of how it feels when we come together as communities. The change in what it means when we believe in ourselves.
There will be people who will listen because they look at you as the youth. They look at you as the future. And they look at you with hope.
I think everybody here knows that we are in the fight of our lives. And this fight is not about science. The issue is not to convince people of the truth. The issue is to convince people of the importance of the truth. We have dealt with pollution before. There's a very simple rule about pollution. The polluter pays.
They have their money. We have our bodies. But we have a duty and an obligation to learn all we can about the injustices.
We need to see within ourselves how we want to change this world. Because you are in charge of the universe. We are one breath. What I breathe, you breathe.
If I don't shift my cause and shift my course to tantalize the mentality of individuals, to go down into the very DNA into who they are, we will all be in a world of hurt in another another 20 years. So we've got to do it, and you've got to do it because this is your moment.
I was surprised by the utter lack of scientific discourse at the conference. But it didn't seem to matter when so many people, young people, were in the throes of dedicating themselves to such worthy causes. No matter how far I travel from home, there is no escaping the Alberta tar sands.
Oil continues to seep to the surface at 4 Canadian Natural Resources spill sites on the Cold Lake Air Weapons Range, which includes the traditional territory of the Treaty 6 Cold Lake First Nations. While CNRL contends with millions of dollars worth of cleanup and the uncertainty of how to stop the oil, band officials say they've had limited access and little in the way of information on environmental impact.
At Power Shift, I spoke with Crystal Lehman, a member of the Beaver Lake Cree Nation and a campaigner for the Indigenous Environmental Network of Alberta.
The process that they're using is actually, it's not in situ, it's not SAGD, it's a process called CSS, cyclic steam simulation. Instead of, steam in, bitumen out, it's steam in, it sits in a well at 300 degrees Celsius, pressure and extreme heat for like 2 weeks, and then they pump it out. And that's what they started using on the Cold Lake Air Weapons Range. The thing with CSS is it's so dangerous that it requires seismic monitoring in the ground. This emulsion is coming out of the ground, and it's halfway up trees, black tar, and they're hiding it. Nobody knows about it.
It seems like this tar sands leak in Alberta has been going on actually for 9 weeks now. It has been going on out of control for more than 2 months, and nobody in the public seems to have known about it until now.
In August, Canadian Natural Resources Limited had already contained 1 million litres of oil, with no sign of when it would stop. Last month, Alberta Environment ordered the company to drain this lake to limit the environmental impact of the leak. Then, on Monday, the province released a document that said the substance has entered the local non-saline groundwater aquifers, likely contaminating the groundwater.
And in the southwest portion of that lake is where Beaver Lake Cree has ancestors buried. So that's a violation. That's I don't even know what to say about that. That was the thing that prompted me. That was the thing that prompted me to get out there.
There is a war on science and scientists in this country.
Critics say some topics are particularly sensitive to the government. Climate change, greenhouse gas emissions, and how it relates to oil sands development.
The public pays for this research, and the public has a right to know it.
The Toronto Star broke this story open after talking to a government scientist who'd been on scene at the spill site, who thought that the response was utter chaos, and who is now essentially blowing the whistle on both the spill and the company responsible. The scientist says the company is not disclosing the scope of these spills and that it's not just one of them. They're taking place, he says, in 4 separate sites in eastern Alberta. The scientist told the Toronto Star, quote, "Everybody at the company and in government is freaking out about this. We do not understand what happened. Nobody really understands how to stop it from leaking."
When we're taking moose from the land that have pus bubbles under the skin and fish that have cancers hanging off of them, we're getting boil water advisories issued by Health Canada. It's no wonder we have to utilize our rights. So our traditional hunting territory spans about 39,000 square kilometers. 34,000 square kilometers of that has been unconstitutionally leased out to every major oil and gas company in the world. So basically, the Canadian and the provincial government didn't consult the Beaver Lake Cree when they leased out these parcels of land. You know, to date, we are now at over 19,000 leases and permits, so the Canadian government continues to push. One company on its own is extracting $6 billion a year from our traditional hunting territory, and we have every major oil company in the world in our traditional hunting territory. So here we are, a community born into third world conditions in a first world country, taking on, you know, one of the most powerful governments in the world. So obviously it's costing us a lot of money, and they know that that's the only thing that's stopping us is money. But that's all we have right now, because the Canadian government has dismantled everything else. The only thing that's slowing these processes right now is Indigenous rights and the rights that we have enshrined in the Canadian Constitution and in international law.
The Fisheries Act is one of the most important pieces of environmental legislation in Canadian history. In the 1970s, the federal government introduced protections within the Fisheries Act that effectively prevented industry from contaminating any waterways, internal or coastal waterways, that are habitat for fish.
We had 2.5 million protected lakes and rivers. To the following day after Bill C-45 was passed, we now have 97 protected lakes and 62 protected rivers.
In 2012, in the federal budget, the budget bill inexplicably included modifications to the Fisheries Act that decreased those protections and in some cases eliminated those protections.
We essentially have seen Budget 2012 used as an excuse for the tabling of 900 pages of legislation largely unrelated to the budget itself. This exercise is both illegitimate and undemocratic. C-38 took an axe to our Fisheries Act, destroying habitat protections, repealed the Environmental Assessment Act, and put in place a substitute piece of legislation that would be an embarrassment to a developing country. We also saw in C-38 the explicit removal of pipelines as a category of obstruction under the Navigable Waters Protection Act.
So further to that was Bill S-8 in the province of Alberta, which is basically the privatization of our water, the commodification of our water. This industry is using 1.7 billion barrels of our fresh water every single day. 80% of the world's 1% of fresh water is in Canada, and they're using 1.7 billion barrels of that every day in this industry.
And can that water be easily cleaned?
It can't be recyclable. They can't fully clean it. You know, you're going to hear industry out there and government out there trying to sell you these false stories.
The global community has an ever-growing appetite for energy. But today, people want to know that energy producers are making responsible choices to protect the environment now and for the future. At Suncor, we welcome this scrutiny. In fact, we've worked hard to create a company that is a leader in continuously improving everything we do. We're happy to have you come see for yourself, ask questions, be part of the dialogue. This just helps us continue to get better and better at what we do.
The Canadian Association of Petroleum Producers has taken on a much more public role in terms of shaping public ideas and perceptions about global warming and the oil industry in Canada.
Where does Canada's energy come from? Canada's energy comes from our many natural resources, but is the result of our ingenuity, our imagination. In Canada's oil sands, energy is more than a product. It's a spirit. It's about innovation and collaboration. It's about developing Canada's energy the Canadian way, to grow our economy and reduce impact on the environment. Canada's oil sands energy is energy we can be proud of, because in Canada, we're pretty good at this.
And so what you see there is a shift from trying to influence the political realm to trying to influence the public realm in terms of the perception of the industry. And that's a really important change, because I think there was a realization by the beginning of the 21st century that public perception of global warming was as important as shaping the thinking of politicians.
The scope of the Canadian Association of Petroleum Producers goes far beyond commercial advertising.
I should tell you, it's very uncomfortable being here. I'm not used to being in rooms full of achievers.
In February 2014, it came to light that CBC pundit Rex Murphy had been paid by CAPP, Enbridge, TransCanada, and Suncor to give public speeches at their events.
This is a triumph of the spirit, not something that anybody has to apologize for. And Alberta and Calgary are among, in my judgment, the most vital and in every sense of the term, one of the most energetic regions in the entire planet. Take care of yourself, drink lots of booze.
It is unethical for a member of the press, especially a member of a nationally backed news outlet, to be accepting patronage from such a contentious and volatile industry, especially when opinions like this reach the air.
The activity out west is the single largest reason Canada has avoided the worst of the world's recession. Whatever the oil sands may represent, the Middle East, Venezuela, Russia, everyone by comparison gets a pass. But poor Canada gets all the silly trophies and is badmouthed by every environmental medicine show from Rio to Copenhagen to Durban. Well, it's a setup.
At this point in your lives, do you spend much time thinking about what the lives of your children might be like in the future?
Well, that's a good question. To an extent, I guess. You think about, keeping the environment and everything like that, but I mean, it's hard to think that far into the future kind of thing, right? Especially with
later next week.
Yeah.
Oh, I'm focusing on my own life right now.
At times I think about it, but times I try not to, because sometimes it's too much to think about.
No, I'm not worried because I'm too young to think about it.
I do, but I don't think in terms of the climate only. I think also in terms of community safety, things like that.
I guess I haven't really thought about that at all. It's really hard to focus on the future when you have like your present issues like every day, so it kind of seems like a long ways away.
Growing up, I always thought that my generation would be better. We would care. We wouldn't get caught up in the mistakes of our parents and grandparents. Now I'm not so sure.
Soldiers in the eastern region of Crimea. They're unarmed, carrying the Ukrainian flag, and they're marching towards Belbek Air Base, which Russian forces took control of a few days ago.
It says here that a few days ago, Russia tested intercontinental ballistic missiles. Even they warned the United States, it's still pretty messed up.
Russian forces have blocked Ukraine's only exit point to the Black Sea by sinking 2 aging vessels here. And a well-armed Russian missile cruiser sits a short distance off the coast. A third of Ukraine's warships are left stranded in the waters close to land, with Russian forces blocking them. Ukraine is now facing a humiliating loss of its navy.
So my buddy Jack told me to come up and visit him at his farm. With the suburbs encroaching on this land, farmers are being forced to move further and further north.
Oh, you think I have carrots? I have food. In the 30s, let's say 95% of Canada were farmers, and that is now flipped. It's 5%. And we're feeding the country, we're feeding other countries too. So by necessity, these farms have to be a lot bigger. If we were in the business of rebuilding all of our buildings, we wouldn't be selling all the herd and the quota. It's just we can't keep up. The vast majority of the herd was in here. This used to be, before we sold all the cows, and the quota would be about 40 head, give or take. We took them out and put them into trailers, and they all went away, 20 cows per trailer. And that was it, that was the end. It was a long time coming, and it was really starting to become too much for my dad to manage. He knew every cow just on sight. We're slowly being surrounded by development. By, you know, there's a subdivision went up there, there's a subdivision going up on that street, like, you know, the line. It's just like a wall. They're coming into Caledon over here, they're going to develop south of us, and we're going to be ended up, you know, just fenced in by development. You're not going to win, they're just going to build around you, right? It's not going to make a statement. And what'll happen is your land will get polluted, you'll be trespassed, and it permanently changes the land. It's like that last final crop you grow is houses. And it's the most profitable one you'll ever grow in your career. Even right now, as we stand here, I'm kind of playing a role of the farmer. I get to luxuriate in that kind of cultural role. I mean, there's no shows about anti-hero farmers, you know. It won't be real anymore. You know, I won't have any connection to a farm other than once I grew up on a farm. A couple years ago, we had a storm come through and tear the roof off this. Just peeled it right back. I was standing in the doorway looking out where we came in, and this big red grain auger was lifted up in the air and flipped in front of me, thrown across the yard. I thought we were in a tornado. I was freaking out.
One thing I notice in an urban area is that you can look 360 degrees and not see a single thing that wasn't shaped by mankind. And so you don't have any natural horizons. You don't have that long view sight.
Over time, like, do you have any memories of how things were compared to how things are now?
That's a hard question. I don't know that I've been alive long enough to trust my memory. I feel like it's been weird recently, but then everyone's telling me it's been weird. If it was that Roland Emmerich movie where tornadoes were blowing up, sucking up Los Angeles and stuff, it'd be easy to react to that, but because nothing's happening day to day, it's easy to forget about.
It almost feels like at this point we've almost lost control of the amount of carbon that's being put up into the atmosphere, because the significant amounts aren't even coming from us.
Yeah, it's indirect now at this point. We've started a ball rolling down a hill.
So why are we still talking about whether or not humans are contributing? Does it even matter now?
I think it does. When the atom bomb was first invented, they didn't realize what they were doing. People forget this, is that even the military, even the scientists didn't have a full understanding of how radiation worked, how it would linger in the environment, how it would affect, how it would spread downwind. You know, they had this it was just math. We have the ability now to vaporize 3 billion people, you know, and cause famine and nuclear winter. And we have, you know, all the crappy politicians and all of the selfish interest groups and all the people who quickly jump to naysaying and doomsday thinking, but we still didn't do it. It's never spelled out for us. The Cold War gave us megaton payloads and, you know, mega deaths as a unit of fatalities, but it also gave us NASA. And so good things, bad things, good things. People who've been super optimistic about jets and space travel have not had that. But the people who thought we'd all be radioactive particles in the stratosphere right now, they were wrong too. It doesn't matter, I don't think, whether we're all going to die. It doesn't matter if New York's going to be flooded, or if all the methane's going to come out of the Arctic and we're all going to starve because plants won't grow anymore. The point is, we have to act knowing that that's a possibility and in defiance of it.
I need to apologize. I didn't want to get caught up in the negativity. I didn't want to make you feel bad. There is hope. I know it. I've seen it. I've felt it. It's too easy to feel sorry for yourself. Guilt is the source of my sadness. Forgiveness will be my salvation. There is a world of positivity. It's out there for anyone open enough to embrace it.
one of the key issues that caused the problem in the first place is that we didn't think in systems. So the question is really, how do we work together, right? How do we create networks? How do we collaborate?
One of the things we have to consider at all times is just how interdisciplinary and at how many scales adaptation has to work. So the problems we're facing are bigger than any one person, any one discipline. But if we're going to have any chance of adapting to climate change, we need not just the full range of academic disciplines, but also the full range of stakeholders from civil society to governments on board.
This project that Dr. Simonovic and several of my colleagues are part of is called Coastal Cities at Risk Due to Climate Change. And our cities are Vancouver, Manila, Bangkok, and Lagos. And saying, okay, what's going to happen in the next 30, 40, 50 years, 60 years to those cities as the climate changes? We've got a top-flight medical doctor professor looking at the health aspects, top-flight economist professor, and the teams of scientists working together to try and build a way of figuring out how to optimize, how do you make it so that the strategies you take actually have the best social benefits, the best health benefits, and you don't leave something out.
We have very substantial amounts of industrial chemical pollution, carcinogenic, highly hazardous compounds, chemicals that have been released and are contaminating our groundwater and making them unfit for consumption. So we have a big opportunity to clean those up and contribute to urban sustainability. And so there's a lot of research going on here on how much of those pollutants are getting into the groundwater in lakes and rivers, and how we can possibly reduce algal blooms, fish kills, deoxygenated zones. We have new technologies that have the ability to use very little energy, that we can use the properties of the contaminants themselves to destroy themselves in the subsurface. We can take advantage of bacteria, stimulate the growth of those naturally occurring bacteria and have them consume the contaminants. And we can also look at things like injecting steam into the ground and other fairly innocuous materials that can interact with contaminants and help degrade them. We know that for every dollar you spend on investment in remediation, you get a $4 return on your investment in terms of boost to the local economy through environmental benefit, social benefit, and economic benefit. So it pays to be green, really, when it comes to remediation.
First, we just want to communicate the seriousness of the issue to the wider population, and that's important, but we also need to figure out a way to empower them so that they'll be able to act on an individual level.
Right? Like how can we ensure that it leads to action rather than apathy?
Is we need to look at who our target audience is and what is going to motivate them into action. It might be financial motivation, and that's okay, or it might be more of an environmental motivation or motivation related to their family or health. Don't just give people a problem to think about, you need to give them a solution. Something that's tangible, something that's measurable, that's something that they can tackle as an individual and feel like they are making a difference.
Enormous amounts of our energy use are sort of predestined by the kinds of communities and cities that we live in. When we live in a denser community, suddenly what we find, of course, is that the things we need are close by. And since the most sustainable trip is the one that you never had to make in the first place, right, suddenly our lives become instantly more sustainable.
Sustainability's gone from a nice to do to a must do. It's about what we do right here, right now, and for the rest of our working lives. And this is what business needs to do. Go all in, go 100%, because then you stop investing in the old stuff, you invest in the new stuff, you lower costs. 100% is easier to do than 90% or 50%. If you have a 90% target, everyone in the business finds a reason to be in the 10%. When it's 100%, it's kind of clear. Business people like clarity, because then you just get the job done. It's about setting a clear direction, being transparent, having a dialogue with the right partners, and choosing to lead on the issues that really count.
As you grow older, new realities present themselves to you. Eventually, naivete must give way to wisdom. It's about survival. It's about life. It's about living with yourself and being proud of where you stand in the world. We all want to live. But do we all want to live well? It's hard to care. It's even harder to admit that you are traversing the wrong path, especially when others are on that path with you. Let's reconnect. Let's reevaluate. What is really important to us? Does the future matter? Should it matter? The answers are within us. They are within me. My life will be my answer. Your life will be yours. Together, we are answering the most important question. Will we be right or will we be wrong?